This is the Gartner Futures Lab podcast.
Welcome to another edition of the Gartner Futures Lab. I'm your host and co-lead of the lab, Marty Resnick, and I am honored to be joined by author and futurist Roger Spitz. Welcome to the show, Roger.
Great to be with you, Marty, and thanks for the Gartner Futures Lab for having me.
Well, great. Why don't we kick things off? Why don't you give a little bit of an introduction about yourself? Introduce yourself to our listeners.
Thanks for that. So I'm Roger Spitz. I'm born in South Africa and moved around quite a bit in my life, lived in 10 different countries, and most of my time I spent working and studying in the UK, and I've been since 2017 based in San Francisco. I used to be an investment banker. I used to be global head of mergers and acquisitions with a large European bank, advising clients in technology on their most strategic acquisitions and divestments and spin-offs and the like. And then about 5-6 years ago, I got a very strong interest in trying to better understand nonlinear change and disruption in the broader sense. And that led me to a journey where I decided to convert full-time to thinking about the future in a more structured way, writing books and setting up some of the institutions, the Disruptive Futures Institute, which is a think tank, and Techistentialism, which is a Foresight strategy practice.
So was there a particular disruption that drove you in this direction, or was it from your work with M&A? I mean, was there some sort of light bulb moment that said, hey, I'm going to move and change kind of fields and industries there?
Yeah, it's always an interesting process, especially with the luxury of hindsight, to sort of look back and think about that. I would say that it wasn't one specific light bulb moment, but I had been approaching 20 years in M&A and had been thinking about for some time, would it be interesting to have a sort of new professional phase and spend more time on things that I felt were more kind of aligned and interesting? Not that M&A isn't interesting. It's very strategic and you're dealing with, a lot of, I guess, people who are thinking about the future and different things. But it's a very kind of specific transactional context, investment banking. But in 2017, our CEO asked me to spend more time in San Francisco, to move, to reinforce the team and to relaunch a number of things. And I was in London at the time. And I took that opportunity basically to go down a rabbit hole, which was to try and, to think, okay, I'm spending a bit more time in the US, in a part of the world that shouldn't be too shabby with innovation, and in Silicon Valley. And so I really decided to go full on with a number of micro courses and just carving out some time from my busy schedule and travel to think about the topics around disruption in the broader sense. So I did courses in complexity at Santa Fe Institute, did courses on Foresight, the same one as you, University of Houston, but also the Institute for the Future. I did courses on disruptive tech in Singularity University, course on AI at MIT, etc. And all of these are, we're talking about micro courses of a few weeks. Did the D School on design thinking. And long story short, that kind of process I did for 2-3 years. And it really gave me a different perspective. What I thought I was doing, which I thought was very long-term thinking and very strategic, I kind of realized that actually it wasn't that long-term thinking. It was very much kind of, short-term market-driven, and that the reality of understanding systemic change and understanding what really drives change, I wasn't really looking at. And so at some point after those few years, I thought rather than sort of spending 10-15% of my time on these topics, I wanted to sort of spend full time. And so that was a gradual process where I decided to have a clean slate, where I, set up Techistentialism as a Foresight strategy practice. I took time to kind of write my initial books. And then the pandemic hit. And so when the pandemic hit and I went out a little bit more with topics like decision-making in certain unpredictable environments and complexity and digging into these topics, it somehow resonated with more people than I realized it would. And that really kind of gave me confidence on my decisions. I took on a few board positions and set up the Disruptive Futures Institute because I suddenly realized that what seemed a bit esoteric and niche some 5 years ago during the pandemic became actually center field and relevant to billions of people, literally. And that's really, fast forward to today, if you think about the broader systemic change and disruptions that are taking place, effectively it's reinforced the need to really focus intentionally on these topics and how much the world, both corporate, institutional, and individuals, need to sort of understand better some of these themes and how best to prepare. So that is kind of the journey. And as I say, it wasn't really a light bulb moment, but I guess something in me wanted to get to that rabbit hole, and then at some point there was a sort of inflection point.
Let me ask you a little bit of a philosophical question, I guess. As a futurist, what is your role and what is your goal?
Yeah, so two different kind of filters you're asking about, right? Role and goal. So let me start with the first one, I guess, just thinking out loud. I think my role is really to think more intentionally about the future. And in doing so, to try and kind of go deeper, longer, and broader than one might with normal kind of cycles of thinking about things that are strategic. So, probably longer time horizons, thinking about next order implications, thinking about things that are kind of may not seem to be connected, but that can be. But ultimately, that role I see as informing decision making today. And that's a very important point. In other words, it's really kind of finding a way of reconciling a perspective of different possible futures with the view of informing decision making in the shorter term, and to hopefully kind of, on one hand, prepare better for the things that might be untoward in terms of the plurality of what might arise, but also opportunistically taking advantage of some of those things we might not have thought about if we were kind of more kind of short term, more kind of narrowly focused. So that's what I see as my role, to think about more systemically longer time horizons, next order implications with a view of informing decision making today. In terms of my goals, and again, futurist is a specific term. I don't mind it, but I see it as foresight and systems thinking in terms of what it entails as kind of domains or what have you. And the important thing in my goals is really, in a way, giving back the benefit which not everybody has, which, having spent 20 years advising, boardrooms and decision makers and shareholders, I think it gives me a reasonable vantage point of connecting things which are sometimes separate or discrete. When I talk to you about all the micro learning I did with some of those courses, I often found that however good the institutions and the topics, they can be quite specialized. Even multidisciplinary can be still quite specialized. And so it was really kind of connecting the dots, if you think about innovation or change or technology or whatever it might be, in a way that really comes back to decision makers, because ultimately, whether we like it or not, it's the organizations, the institutions that drive a lot of what happens in the world. And so my goal is really to leverage on those insights I got over a few decades, to leverage on the additional new learnings over the past, 6-7 years, and really to help as many people as possible, not just organizational for that matter. I'm almost more interested in the individuals in the world. I spend a lot of time with institutions, but a lot of time globally with individuals as well, just to help them have a better understanding of the agency we have in terms of driving the possible futures and preparing for the potential surprises, some of which would not necessarily be surprises if we had a better understanding of some of the things that can arise.
So when you talk about agency, are you saying the future is in our hands and we have control?
So that's a that's a very big philosophical and existential question, which I'm happy to address, because I actually consider myself to be an existential philosopher and enjoy those topics. I'll try and kind of keep it relatively down to earth and reasonably kind of framed in terms of not spending 5 hours or 20 years on it. So the question you're asking, I think, is, I use the word agency and helping people, gain agency around how they might shape potential futures and prepare for things. And so the question then boils down to, what control do you have on anything, let alone the future? So the first thing I would say, and maybe I should have said that explicitly at the beginning for those who may not be completely familiar with the role of a futurist or what it's meant to be. In my books, a futurist, and no one for that matter, is able to or should be purporting to know the future or to predict the future. The future is unknowable. And so one of the key aspects is thinking about the possibilities that might arise, those that are more plausible, and thinking about how best to leverage on the opportunities and prepare for the risks. And so in doing so, I do believe there's some degree of agency. Now, it doesn't mean we control everything or anything per se, and it doesn't mean that they aren't completely external things that don't happen. But even when things do happen, you do have a choice as to how you react to them. And I'm going to just use Jean-Paul Sartre and some of the existential philosophers to illustrate what I mean by agency. And I guess it's the distinction between when Jean-Paul Sartre says we exist, we reveal ourselves to the world, and then we create our beingness, it effectively, what he's trying to say or saying is existence precedes the essence. And that means you have, a degree of freedom, agency, and choice, which defines who you are, what you do through your actions. And those are not predetermined. The opposite of that is that things are predetermined. So actually, I think it's quite unhealthy to think that you can purport to predict a future, because it almost suggests that things are predetermined and it takes away the freedom, agency, and choice one has as humans. So, in that sense, if that wasn't a kind of too long or distorted way of answering, in that sense, I do believe that we have agency to exercise a degree of freedom, agency, and choice. And the way we perceive the world and the way we think about possible futures emergent is likely going to affect how you choose to exercise that freedom, agency, and choice. The one final comment I'd make, though, is that agency is an option. It's not something that happens automatically. And like with any option, unless you exercise it, it doesn't exist. So the underlying element of freedom, agency, and choice is that you consume it, that you actually exercise the actions, that you do something about it. And so one of the very important things with agency is that you really have to be intentional about making certain choices and doing certain things. And the lack of it is either because of, you choose not to, or you're not aware that you should be. And those kind of can feed the status quo and other things. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting as a futurist. We get a lot of conversations around what you just said. If nobody can tell the future, and the future isn't linear and it's always changing. And of course, I use my master Yoda quote around difficult to see, always in motion is the future. Then kind of what's the point of us looking into the future? And I usually say it's really about preparing us for today or providing actions for today to make a better tomorrow. I mean, how would you answer that question?
The way I look at it is effectively, if you take disruption in the sense of systemic disruption, so we're not just talking about, innovation or technology or Silicon Valley or whatever, you really think about nonlinear change more broadly. At my end, from our work and at the Disruptive Futures Institute, I consider that there are three things that impact the degree of surprise or disruption that you will receive, okay? One is the perspective. So how do you see the world? What is your worldview? What are the assumptions you make about the world? Two is how do you prepare for how you see the world? I mean, if you see the world with certain possibilities or possible outcomes, you're probably going to prepare differently from if you don't, right? So, if you take a pandemic, if you take a specific opportunity, you're going to prepare for things if you're more aware and tuned in to that. And then the third thing is if and when things just happen, how and when do you respond to those external changes? So effectively, how do you see the world, number one? Number two, how do you prepare for the way you see the world? And number three, what's the nature and timing of the response? So those for me are the factors which really impact the degree of disruption you'll have as humans or organizations or what have you. And coming back, therefore, to the question around, what's the point of looking to the future? You can't predict it. You don't know. How does it change anything? Well, my personal view from our work, and we see it every day, is that it does change, because if you're preparing for a number of possibilities, if you're thinking about the world in a certain way, if you're challenging the assumptions you're making about what's possible and what might happen, those different perspectives are likely to inform your preparation today, as well as how you might respond when things happen. And to that effect, that will effectively shape the future. Or coming back to the existential question around agency, those decisions will effectively create the essence or your beingness. And therefore, they are shaping the futures that might arise.
In your books, you have a lot of different frameworks that you talk about, all the way from AAA, climate foresight, techistentialism. How do you bring all those together, or do they have very unique purposes, different frameworks for different types of, let's say, goals or whatever you're trying to figure out as a futurist?
So the overarching framework we focus on is really the AAA framework. And then some of the other things you mentioned, which we can touch upon, are, specific tools or ways of feeding into the AAA framework. And the AAA framework is meant to be relatively simple in concept. It's really three aspects, none of which we've kind of invented, but we weave them in and pose use cases, which incidentally are real world live cases. One of the reasons that we have the Disruptive Futures Institute as well as Techistential as a Foresight strategy practice is that our practitioner work informs the think tank and executive education. But coming back to the framework, the AAA framework is effectively the first A is anti-fragile, the second A is anticipatory, the third A is agility. So by anti-fragile, we're really borrowing Nassim Taleb's work on anti-fragility and his Incerto 5-volume work on uncertainty. And effectively, anti-fragile is, for us, it's the foundations. There are certain foundations which, even if you have shocks, will basically not only be resilient to that, but strengthen. So this gives you kind of optionality. It means that randomness and errors and complex systems are not a problem if you have the right kind of foundations. Those foundations are actually very resilient, and beyond resilience can actually benefit from errors, from risk, from complexity and other things, which is a given. So, for us, you have to have anti-fragile foundations because the world is complex and has shocks and randomness and other things. So that's one of the A's. The second one is anticipatory. So that's really the bread and butter of the Foresight field, I guess, where you're trying to think about possible futures, you're trying to prepare for those possible futures, you're trying to think about what are the signals, what are the possible impacts of things you're seeing, what are the next order implications, and what are the opportunities of those, how to think about the degrees of uncertainty, etc. And so here you're exercising a good chunk of the Foresight playbook around scanning and signals and scenario development and what have you. And agility is really that recognition that in the end, only the present exists. So you're thinking about, a longer term future with anticipatory, but ultimately the here and now is the only thing that exists. You need to kind of bridge longer term visions with the present. You need sense making. You need to kind of experiment and amplify what's working, dampen what isn't. You need to somehow find a way of emerging in this complex environment. You need to constantly update things because things are changing, they're dynamic. So you need feedback loops. And so agility is really, how do you reconcile that? So effectively, our underlying framework is to say the world is unpredictable, it's complex, there are constant shocks. You need anti-fragile foundations because there's certain things that will be more beneficial if, unpredictable things happen, because by definition, change is a constant. You need to think more long-term about the future because of the reasons we talked about earlier, which is you'll probably prepare differently if you have a broader sense of possibilities, both for the positive and for the risks. And then you need to acknowledge that you're not today 10 years away and that things are constantly updating. So you need the agility, the cognitive, strategic, and emergent agility to kind of reconcile that longer term vision with the present. So that fundamentally is a AAA framework. And then I won't unpack them now unless you have specific ones you wish me to. But then within that, there are a number of specific toolkits and other things which are useful to think about. But fundamentally, it all boils down to what are the foundations you have? How do you think systemically long-term about the future or the futures, should I say? And then how do you kind of emerge in the here and now and bridge the different time horizons?
It seems that a lot of what we do as futurists is we're trying to understand and, let's say, unpack this chaotic and disruptive world that we're living in. But one of the challenges I see is that, historically, the world's always been chaotic and volatile. It's just maybe it's more in our face now than it was in the past because we can share information faster or whatever else. Do you think the world is much more chaotic and continuing to get more chaotic, or do you think it's kind of always been and maybe we're just seeing it better?
So I think the fundamental features of the world, which haven't changed and don't change, no doubt about that. And nature works in the way it works. Cities are complex animals and they work the way they work. They interact. They're multiple drivers of change. They're unpredictable, but somehow kind of systems that work. So I think the fundamental features of the world as such and the way individuals operate haven't necessarily changed per se. What I do believe is different now is a number of things. And just to take a step back, one of the issues in my mind of how the world is reacting to change is not necessarily that there's an issue with the way the world is. The world is a pretty mature, well-run machine and miracle. and there's nothing wrong with the way the world operates. I think the issue is the assumptions maybe we make about the world, and in the assumptions we make about the world, how we see the world, and therefore how we prepare and how we respond to shocks, which ties up a little bit to what we were saying earlier around, what we see as the facts of disruption and the role of a futurist. So what I'm trying to say is that if you take, a Newtonian, simplified, deterministic, mechanical view of the world, and you have educational systems that are based on that, and then you have governance systems that are based on that, and then you teach leadership teams how to work based on a linear, stable, and predictable world, and then you have incentives that are based on that. The challenge maybe is the educational system, the governance systems, the incentive structures, and not necessarily the world itself. If you take, for instance, Zen Buddhism or Eastern philosophy, they have a view of the world which is transient, where change is a constant. And the Greeks had the same thing. You never put your foot in the same water twice. One, because the water is moving, and two, because you as a human and your foot is changing. So if you have a sense that the change is a constant, you're not going to be as kind of frazzled when change arises. If you're taught that things are stable, linear, and predictable, and everything, the systems, the structures, the education, and governance are based on that assumption, maybe the assumption is wrong. So what I would now reframe in terms of whether the world is changing more or less or what have you, it may or it may not be, but I think that what is changing now is that the cost of relying on the wrong assumptions is higher, because I believe that there's an inverse relationship between predictability and uncertainty. And the greater the uncertainty, the greater the cost of relying on assumptions of the world being stable, predictable, and linear. And I believe there are a certain number of factors that are driving systemic change, which are increasing uncertainty. Some is technology, some is the speed of connectivity, some is social media, some is AI. We can unpack a number of factors which are both, technology and not technology, but which effectively move you from a frame of risk. You understand the parameters and you just need to calibrate the risk associated with them. What's the risk of having an accident if you drive at a certain speed, or having lung cancer if you're a smoker, to then understand uncertainty, which is, okay, there are a few possible scenarios and you're just not sure exactly how to rank them, but you can kind of have a sense of the possibilities and the probabilities of uncertainty. And I think that we're in an era of deep uncertainty where you can't actually enumerate the number of possibilities. There's no agreement on what those possibilities are or how to address them for those that are challengers. And therefore, you certainly can't probabilize them. And there are just too many different permutations, possibilities, some that are life-changing. What is a human being? Will there be singularity? Will we work and live on Mars? Will you live 200 years? And a number of other things that are very transformational. And so I believe that it's that move from risk to uncertainty to deep uncertainty that puts us in a deeply uncertain world. And the cost of relying on the assumptions of a linear and stable and predictable world is increasing. And yet we're not updating the educational system, the governance structures, the incentive structures, or anything in the world to update with the fact that things are unpredictable, non-linear, and constantly changing. And so I guess to answer your question, I would say it's not necessarily that the world is completely changing, but the fact that the world is updating itself and evolving to a degree, and that humans aren't, and the impact on us is therefore as if the world was completely radically changing, as opposed to the fact that we're still living in a simplified, deterministic, Newtonian view of the world.
That's a really interesting perspective, the cost on relying on assumptions. I'm wondering, how does that tie into maybe some of your other frameworks? I know you and I have talked about techistentialism, for example. So if we take this AAA framework and we take the importance of how we act and how we prepare for this chaotic world, where does techistentialism fit into all that?
Yeah, so I'm deeply passionate about existentialist philosophy. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the tenets of existentialist philosophy is the degree with which we have freedom, agency, and choice. And techistential or techistentialism is really a combination of technology with existential or existentialism. So techistentialism is technology and existentialism. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that if you take the 19th or the 20th century and you had Simone de Beauvoir and you had Jean-Paul Sartre and they were sitting at the Domago in Paris and chatting, there were a lot of things that were happening in the world and a lot of world wars and a lot of uncertainties. But somehow humans broadly had exclusivity on human decision making. So fast forward to the 21st century, where you probably cannot look at the human condition without thinking about how it interacts with technology. In other words, when you look at the 21st century, you're thinking about the human condition in a technological world. In that technological world where there's AI, and you can debate whether AI actually makes decisions and understands things, that's almost a separate debate. But in that world of the 21st century where the human condition is intimately linked to a technological world, you're basically thinking about the existential and the technological condition, whereby humans and algorithms make decisions. So tech essentialism is really existentialism 2.0 in the 21st century. And then if you think about the different elements of the AAA, let's take, for instance, being anticipatory. One of the things that's important being anticipatory, and you could also argue agility, is understanding the degrees of uncertainty. So you will know for sure, and many of your listeners will know, but there are various animals that are used to describe the degrees of uncertainty or certainty. So the gray rhino is for known knowns, and where the gray rhino is charging at you, so effectively you know what's happening, it's extremely high probability, it's happening fast, there's a lot of evidence, etc. The black jellyfish is more unknown knowns, so it's emergent, there's initially a low probability, but things can go out of hand. The black jellyfish was initially mentioned by a researcher who realized that with global warming, the sea was rising, there were more jellyfish. And suddenly, what seemed unrelated, when nuclear plants and big US ships, etc., were being blocked and clogged by these jellyfish, they realized these second, third order implications were arising from a known unknown. We knew that jellyfish were increasing. We didn't know that it would mean that power plants would go down. And then you have black elephants, which are known unknowns, and the black swans, which are the unknown unknowns. So if you look at AI in that world and link it to tech essentialism, for me, I consider that basically I treat the question of AI, which is a big driver of change, in an existentialist way, which is different from the simplified existential definition of the current debates, which is to say it's a threat to humanity. I believe that existentialism and an existential risk is something that's a threat to human agency, choice, and freedom. Yes, human extinction is definitely a threat to human agency, choice, and freedom, but there are many things that fall between just everyday existence that impact our decision making that are not necessarily threatening our extinction. And so if you take these animals and degrees of uncertainty and tech essentialism, you could argue that the gray rhinos, the known knowns, is already what's happening with social media, the manipulation from social media, the impact on society, on Brexit, on US elections, on COVID. These are killing people. These are gray rhinos. The disinformation and misinformation is already there. If you think about the fact that we need to upskill ourselves for critical thinking, for digital fluency, for many things in the context of AI, and we're not doing that, those are gray rhinos, the automation of the workforce. And then we can look at black jellyfish. Black jellyfish, the scaling of bias, the possible fusion of AI and biotechnology and humans. And then you can look at black elephants, should you be reinventing education completely? What about, mass technological unemployment, cyber risks? And then you could say black swans, will they be AGI? Will they be artificial general intelligence, super intelligence? What if they were catastrophic failures that were prolonged, where you didn't have connectivity, which brought humanity through the dark ages? So the point I'm trying to make is that if you think about tech essentialism, you're thinking about the impact of human and algorithmic decision making. You're thinking about the fact that humans are de-skilling and less good at making decisions maybe over time because they're relying on machines to make decisions because of complexity or because it's easy or because they just don't exercise that agency to make decisions. And so if you then come back to the future, you're looking at humanity, which is potentially not exercising decision-making as well or as much. You're looking at different degrees of uncertainty and possibilities with AI that are taking place. And then how does it link to the AAA? Well, if you don't have the right anti-fragile foundations with governance systems, with educational systems, with incentives, if you're not anticipatory enough to realize the different degrees of uncertainty which are happening with our black elephants and black swans and black jellyfish and gray rhinos, and if you don't have the agility to update the rescaling and certain ways people think about work, and there's just a very polarized debate. From one extreme, will it be the end of humanity? And the other extreme sort of saying that it's a utopia and wonderful thing, AI. And there's nothing in between that's addressing the different aspects. And you're not building more anti-fragile foundations, and you're not being more agile, and you're not thinking more about the different possibilities of what might happen in a way that's not polarized and just looking at two extreme scenarios, but more broadly. Effectively, that is where humanity literally is, I think, challenged to all the worst possible outcomes and not benefiting from the great opportunities that can also happen from technology, just simply because you're kind of oversimplifying, taking a polarized debate, and really not dealing with things in a foundational, anticipatory, and agile way.
You got my mind spinning about gray rhinos for a second. And I totally forgot about the animals associated with known knowns and known unknowns. So I appreciate you reminding me of those. I used to call unknown unknowns koala bears, but I think there's a lot of different animals we threw out for those. But I'm thinking about the gray rhino, and maybe this is a bad analogy. I don't know. But if I know that social media is going to spread chaos and disinformation, and I don't do anything about it, I mean, I'm essentially ignoring another animal, the elephant in the room. So I'm not doing anything about it. What makes us think as futurists, if I can examine possible unknown unknowns or black swans or something like that, that anybody's going to do anything about those things when they're not doing anything about the gray rhino?
Yeah, so these are obviously very intricate to unpack, right? But I'll do my best. So, a few thoughts. First of all, these are just metaphors. So, I think to your koala bears or whatever, there's no right or wrong type of animal or categorization, etc. It's not always so clear cut. Like many things, once you realize it in our fields and that, a lot of it is kind of liminal and blurred and sometimes contradictory, etc. But let's take those animals as I've kind of tried to describe them. And then the next thing I would say is what's interesting with these categories, it comes back to our earlier discussion about what do I think the role of as a futurist. And I mentioned three things that can impact how much you're surprised or disruptive. One is how you see the world, two is how you prepare for how you see the world, and three is how you respond, how and when you respond to things that happen. Basically, the classification of these known knowns or known unknowns varies depending on how you prepare and how you see the world, okay? Because clearly, if you're cognizant of certain things, if you think that they're possibilities, if you connect the dots of things that seem unrelated, you're going to categorize it differently. In other words, a black swan is often a go-to label and cluster for people who are unprepared. They'll say, oh, COVID is a black swan. This is a black swan. Well, no, maybe it was actually a gray rhino or black elephant. So the point I'm making, and this is directly linked to what does a futurist do and what is the role and goal of a futurist, or for me at least, is actually to be more granular about what we do think we know, what we don't know, versus what might be completely black swan. So that's a very important point, because the more I personally believe people think in a structured way about the future possibilities with humility about what we actually know and an appreciation of the unpredictability and the next order implications, the less strict you're going to be on the classification and the more you're going to be thinking about the possible outcomes as opposed to just labeling something a black swan. And so in that sense, then to your question about, what should I be doing about disinformation, misinformation, or if no one else is doing something about it? Well, I think here that's where the reason we think about the AAA as a framework is because our world is complex and systemic. In other words, there's nothing you or I or any organization can do individually that is going to address any of this per se. So once again, it brings a sort of separate but related topic about how do you drive change through complex systems. And that's, systems thinking is a great tool for that. And so there are certain things you can do at the individual level. There's certain things you need to do at the societal level. But ultimately, it's like COVID, right? If you and I did something or a specific country did something, ultimately, if there's not some sort of cohesion and alignment, it doesn't work. And so the point about thinking about the AAA is if they aren't the right foundations like correct, relevant education that's teaching you about critical thinking, if there isn't the right, anticipatory thinking around legislation and regulation that can make sure that there are better incentives for the tech companies to be behaving in a certain way, etc., etc. If you're not thinking about things systemically with the different dimensions, effectively, that's where things become tricky, right? Because you're right. I mean, there's probably nothing you or I can do for misinformation, disinformation, but there are many things that can be done. It's just that they're not going to be discrete and related quick fixes. They need to be sort of brought through the different leverage points. They'll all affect either, how you prepare for long-term events, how you react to things as and when thing happens today with the agility, and what foundations, and resilience individuals, organizations, and society have embedded.
Yeah, it all goes back to some of the things that we talk about on this podcast about being a futurist is we've got to think about the world holistically and look at the future holistically. A lot of times we're saying, hey, what's the future of AI or what's the future of the metaverse or whatever else? And really it's about what's the future of the world and then how is that going to impact those other things? Would you agree with that statement?
I mean, I agree with a lot of the concepts and the fundamentals around, holistic. I guess one could think about unpacking, understanding the future of the world. The world is unpredictable, but we do have certain things that we know, that we have certain degrees of understanding of certain things at a given time. They might change completely 10 seconds later, but at a given time, there's certain degrees of certainty of what's hitting us today. The thing about holistic and systems, which is tricky, is linked to kind of alignment, right? And I'm broadly hopeful if society understands the things that need to be done and work on sort of changing them. I think we do have agency as humanity to kind of reorient whichever point we are in the world and however desperate things might look. That's why I don't like terms like polycrisis and that, because they kind of almost take away the agency. I broadly think we do have agency to change things, but the challenge is we will not have a consensus as to how we see the world. And we will not have a consensus around the actions that are required for some of these complex problems. So it's kind of finding that balance where you have some systems level change, which are addressing at a foundational way and the education and incentive structures that can move us in a position which is not kind of as extreme as it currently seems or could be, without necessarily sort of having this kind of complete consensus or alignment on a vision of the future. In other words, there's certain things that can be self-reinforcing in a positive way, positive inflection points and positive systems level changes, even without necessarily having clarity at all on the future, if that makes sense.
I feel like I can talk to you for hours about some of these topics. These are big, heavy topics. So I appreciate you sticking in there with me for a few here. We are going to have to start wrapping up. And as I ask every guest on our podcast to leave us with a golden nugget, do you have any golden nuggets for our listeners you want to leave them with?
Yeah, the one I kind of mentioned already a few times, which for me is really when the penny dropped, is, disruption is no longer really kind of a single or a recurring event. It's a steady state, it's a constant, and it's expanding its impact. And that for me is really the overriding driver, which then boils down to the preparation, how we need to think about the world, etc. It's really that idea that change is a constant.
Well, great. I really appreciate the time today. I really enjoyed our conversation. So thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. It was a great chat, and I look forward to continuing and hearing a lot about how you think about that. We didn't have enough time I spoke too much and didn't leave you maybe enough time to also get your reactions, but it was a very thoughtful questions. Thanks for having me, Marty.
I do appreciate your time today. So thank you so much.
Please subscribe and share the episode with your colleagues. Thank you for listening. Gartner podcasts are a production of Gartner, the world's leading research and advisory company, equipping executives across the enterprise with indispensable insight, advice, and tools to achieve their mission-critical priorities. You can learn more at Gartner.com. All content in Gartner podcasts is owned by Gartner and cannot be repurposed or reproduced without Gartner's consent. Gartner is an impartial, independent analyst of business and technology. This content should not be construed as a Gartner endorsement of any enterprise's product or services. All content provided by other speakers is expressly the views of those speakers and their organizations.